Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most unbelievable reversals of fortune in modern history. We're talking about the highly dramatic origins of the American Revolution. So picture the scene, all right? The year is 1763. The British Empire has just emerged totally victorious from the global 7 Years' War. They absolutely dominate their French and Spanish rivals, claiming these vast, sprawling new territories. The sun literally never sets on this empire. But remarkably, within just 10 years, this ultimate triumph is going to inadvertently spark a massive, continent-shaking rebellion.
So it really begs the question, right? How exactly does a victorious, unrivaled empire accidentally trigger a massive rebellion in just 10 short years? I mean, it's a complete 180-degree reversal of fortune. We're going to explore this incredible, dramatic shift, starting from Britain's absolute global triumph in 1763, all the way to a colonial society standing on the very brink of total chaos and war by 1773.
What we're looking at here is a turbulent, fast-paced, 10-year countdown. We kick things off with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, then move swiftly into the massive uproar of the Stamp Act, escalate into the tragic bloodshed of the Boston Massacre, and finally culminate in the explosive Boston Tea Party in 1773. It took just 10 years to completely sever an empire.
Okay, to understand how things fell apart so quickly, we really have to look at the fallout of that big victory. Yes, in 1763, the British Empire is victorious, but they are absolutely drowning in a staggering national debt. The sheer cost of fighting a global war ballooned the country's finances so badly that interest payments alone were eating up more than half of Britain's annual spending. Imagine half of your entire budget being gone before you even start paying your bills. And on top of all that, they now had these vast new American territories to defend from rival empires, not to mention dealing with Native American uprisings like Chief Pontiac's revolt.
But while Britain was drowning in debt, the 13 colonies across the Atlantic were booming. 2 million. That's a massive number. Thanks to years of solid economic prosperity and a heavy wave of immigration from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, the colonial population had absolutely exploded to over 2 million people. We're not just talking about a scattering of tiny, rugged outposts anymore. This was a massive, highly established, and incredibly diverse society.
And you know, with that kind of population boom comes a totally shifting colonial culture. See, for most of their 150-year history, the colonies were managed through a policy of salutary neglect, which basically means Britain just left them alone to manage their own affairs. Because of this freedom, Americans naturally became way less deferential to the motherland. They were highly enterprising and increasingly self-confident. So when Britain's massive debt crisis forces them to suddenly end this salutary neglect and actually start paying close attention to the colonies, a massive cultural clash is absolutely guaranteed.
Now, put yourself in London's shoes for a second. Asking the colonists to pitch in and help pay the tab seemed, well, perfectly reasonable. Consider the sheer contrast here. The average Briton paid 26 shillings a year in tax, but a New Englander, they paid just 1 single shilling. To the British Prime Minister, George Grenfell, fixing the empire's spiraling debt simply had to involve raising colonial taxes. It was just basic math to them.
But that financial gap, that provided the spark that lit the powder keg. First, Parliament passed the 1764 Sugar Act to tighten up tax collection. Then, a year later, came the Stamp Act, slapping a tax on all commercial and legal documents, everything from your daily newspapers to attorneys' licenses. London honestly didn't expect much of a fuss. Englishmen back home had been paying these kinds of taxes for decades, but the immediate result in America was a massive colonial uproar. And why? Because Grenville's taxes hit the most articulate, influential, and loud members of society the hardest. We're talking about the merchants, the business owners, and the lawyers.
Because at the heart of all this uproar was one simple, uniting battle cry: no taxation without representation. The fierce opposition pouring out of colonial newspapers and pamphlets wasn't just about losing money or the financial burden of the taxes itself. It was fundamentally about the constitutional principle of consent. The colonists strongly argued that as British subjects, their rights under the British Constitution were being completely trampled. They had no elected representatives back in the British Parliament, so in their eyes, Parliament had zero right to tax them.
And this ideological stand quickly transformed into the rise of a fierce, organized resistance. It escalated from Patrick Henry proposing radical resolutions in the Virginia House of Burgesses to delegates actually organizing unified petitions straight to King George III. But it didn't stay in the meeting halls. It spilled right into the streets. Colonial merchants organized widespread, crushing boycotts of British goods. Mobs began violently attacking tax collectors, driving them out of town, and burning effigies on what they proudly called Liberty trees. This was the birth of real, organized physical resistance.
Now, the sheer economic damage of those boycotts, combined with all the uproar, actually forced the British government to back down. They scrapped the Stamp Act in 1766, a huge victory for the colonies, right? Well, not exactly. Take a look at this quote from the Declaratory Act, which Parliament passed on the exact same day they repealed the tax. They stated they had full power and authority to make laws in all cases whatsoever. They were totally doubling down on their absolute authority. They were essentially saying, look, we're removing this tax right now, but we still own you. So the immediate storm had passed, but another one was definitely on the horizon.
Sure enough, as new taxes like the Townshend Acts were inevitably passed, colonial society began to deeply fracture. We really start to see the emergence of two defining factions. A patriot was a colonist who aggressively opposed British taxation and authority, and they frequently clashed with loyalists who just wanted to avoid confrontation and remain loyal to the crown. Patriot groups, who famously called themselves the Sons of Liberty, led by really prominent figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, began to actively rabble-rouse and push the envelope.
And this deeply fractured society eventually hit a deadly breaking point. Boston had basically become a pressure cooker of Patriot activity, so the British had quartered soldiers right there in the city to keep the peace. But on March 5th, 1770, a localized altercation between soldiers and locals turned into a terrifying standoff. A small detachment of British soldiers was completely surrounded and taunted by an angry crowd of hundreds, pelted with rocks, ice, and snowballs. The soldiers panicked, lost their nerve, and opened fire into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed in what became forever immortalized as the Boston Massacre.
The reactions to this bloodshed were just wildly divided. For the Patriots, it was the ultimate powerful propaganda of British tyranny. Paul Revere even created a famously sensationalized engraving to spread the outrage far and wide. But moderates on both sides desperately wanted to de-escalate the situation. In fact, in a truly surprising twist of history, the British soldiers were actually acquitted of murder because they were defended in court by none other than John Adams, a very prominent Patriot lawyer. He stepped up because he wanted to prove to the world that the colony still respected legal order and fair trials.
Following the massacre, Britain actually repealed most of the Townshend taxes, leaving only a single tax on tea, and a sort of relative calm returned. But underneath that calm, a bitter, intense smuggling conflict was completely boiling over. New England merchants were heavily bypassing British import duties. In response, Britain aggressively clamped down, using the Royal Navy to seize ships belonging to well-known patriots like John Hancock, and then trying them in military-style vice admiralty courts. The tension was so incredibly high that in 1772, the Sons of Liberty actually boarded a grounded Royal Navy schooner, the HMS Gaspee, and brazenly burned it right down to the waterline.
Which finally brings us to the ultimate catalyst of the revolution, the 1773 Tea Act. Believe it or not, this explosive event actually started as a simple corporate bailout in London. The East India Company, the empire's absolute largest corporation, was facing bankruptcy, so Parliament stepped in and allowed them to sell cheap tea directly to the colonies. But, and this is crucial, they kept that hated 3p tax attached to it. This move completely backfired. It managed to unite everyday patriots and wealthy colonial smugglers in absolute outrage. The British were basically undercutting local colonial businesses while still stubbornly enforcing taxation without representation.
And that sets the cinematic stage for December 1773 and the legendary Boston Tea Party. When 3 East India Company ships refused to turn back and anchored in Boston Harbor, the Patriot response was incredibly dramatic. Under the pitch-black cover of a chilly December evening, members of the Sons of Liberty boldly disguised themselves as Native Americans, which they used as a symbol of their distinct new American identity, stormed the ships, and systematically broke open 340 chests of tea.
To really wrap your head around the gravity of this event, just consider the sheer scale of the destruction. 92,000 pounds, that is exactly how much tea they dumped into the freezing, dark waters of Boston Harbor. To put that into perspective, in today's money, that is nearly $2 million worth of private corporate property completely destroyed in a single coordinated night of defiance.
So, by the end of 1773, we have reached the ultimate breaking point, and it's beautifully captured by 2 totally irreconcilable views. Patriot John Adams called the Tea Party a magnificent movement, full of majesty and sublimity. He saw it as a necessary, noble strike by the people. But the British government? They looked across the Atlantic and saw only pure lawlessness, dangerous mob rule, and an outrageous, unforgivable attack on private property. To London, if they didn't act with extreme firmness right now, their authority would lie in tatters. The gloves were officially coming off.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up the explainer today. When two sides look at the exact same historical event, and one sees it as completely magnificent, while the other sees it as absolute mob rule, is violent conflict just inevitable at that point? We've seen how 10 short years of escalating action and reaction, of clashing cultures and heavy-handed policies, managed to permanently fracture a mighty empire. The actual war for independence hasn't started just yet, but the road to rebellion has absolutely reached its final, inescapable destination. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.